Welcome back again to the Ivory Tower Collections. Today we're going to talk about something that I've actually had for a couple of months now, I guess, but hadn't really had a chance to talk about it. And it is this thing right here. This is the Roland MT-300 music player. So basically the MT series of modules, when they came out in the 90s, were primarily designed for teaching and helping to teach to play music, usually with something like a digital keyboard attached to the Midi module itself. In addition to learning how to play music, you could also use it as a sequencer. So you could hook up a Midi keyboard or controller to it, and you could actually record portions or parts of songs a little at a time, and then with some simple editing features that it has within the module, you could splice and combine and put your compositions together, and then in turn it would allow you to save them to a floppy drive. Now you will notice that there's no floppy drive present on this unit. In fact, I have installed a Gotek floppy emulator in it. However, I do have the original floppy drive still here, and it still works just fine, but I just prefer to like to have all my music more easily accessible with a thumb drive. But, as the name also implies, it says music player, which means it can also play back MIDI files that have been stored on diskette through the module in kind of sort of a jukebox fashion. Now, some of the differences with the MT-300 versus the MT-200 that I've spoken about before is, for starters, the MT-300 actually came out later. This unit came out around 1998, which is approximately 4 years newer than the MT-200 that preceded it. Additionally, although it does say General MIDI and GS for the Roland GS standard, and it basically has the same number of instrument tones, it has a few more instrument tones versus the MT-200, but some of the tones are a little bit different as far as the instrumentation itself sounds different. But probably the biggest differences between this unit and its older brother, the MT-200, is the fact that unlike the MT-200, which was only basically 24 voice polyphony, MT-300 is actually 64 voice polyphony. So it's able to play a lot more instruments, and instruments with more higher quality samples, especially those in stereo sound, at once simultaneously versus the MT-200 before it actually has to start dropping off notes. In fact, I haven't really heard any MIDI songs that I've played on this from in the 90s era that really causes this module any problems. Aside from that, it has basically the same drum sets and the same sound effects set as the standard GS modules like the SC55 and the MT-200 does. But there are some additional differences. Again, some of the instrumentation sounds a little different, some of the sound effects are different, some are better, some not so much. Same thing with the instrumentation. Some of the instruments sound really, really good through this module, and others, they're different enough that I'm not really sure. I could be torn either way. Another big difference with this module is that it actually features more reverb and chorus effects versus the MT-200, so there's a total of like 8 types of different reverb and chorus. It also has delays. Now, as far as the other capabilities go, they're very, very similar and almost the same. And in fact, you'll even notice that the front panel, if you've seen the video on the MT-200, is very, very similar. We have our power button down here. It does feature a front headphone input, which is nice. It's using a standard 3.5mm plug for that. We have the same rheostat for a volume slider here as what was present on the MT-200. We have the same song button. We have a beat, tempo, transpose buttons. We have the different track options for rhythm 1, 2, 3, and 4. We have the count in, the metronome, forward and back buttons, the reset button, the stop, play, and record, just like the MT-200 and other similar devices. Where it gets a little bit different is over here. The MT-200 had a separate panel that opened up that had some additional feature buttons in it. That's all been incorporated right here under the top, either through the use of additional menus that you can scroll through, or just with buttons that have been added. So as an example, we have our standard menu button here. Here's the disk button, which is where you would go to prepare, format, and save disk compositions. You have your tuning button here where you can adjust the tuning for instrument. This is the edit track, is where you would go to edit parts of compositions or sequences of music that you have recorded and programmed into the unit. We have the 16 track button here, which is a little bit different. Specifically what the 16 track button is for setting up and allowing you to individually mute out the different channels of instruments while a module is playing. You'll notice on this LCD panel, which is also quite a bit larger than the 200 by the way, has more detailed information as you'll see. We have numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, all the way up to 16. So using the 16 track button allows you to use the beat and tempo buttons to go to the selected track you want and either mute it or have it play. So by doing that, you can filter out and only listen to instruments that you really want to hear. So aside from that, let's take a quick peek around the back of the unit. So the back of the unit is very similar also to the MT-200 in that we have our AC power cord. Now this is a little bit different. The MT-200 and other modules of the time frame, a lot of them actually required a separate power brick to actually operate. Whereas with the 300, it has its own built-in power supply. Otherwise, you just have to have a standard figure 8 type power cord that plugs in. We have our microphone input, so similar to the MT-80 and other devices, you can plug in a separate microphone and you can control its separate volume and echo, so you could use this essentially for karaoke type stuff if you wanted to. Here are our outputs. Listed here is just right and left. It uses standard RCA type output jacks. That's another difference from the earlier module in that the earlier module actually used 1/4 inch mono jacks for each of the separate channels. We have input ports here for the start and stop and expression pedals that can be added. Again, these are mainly used for whenever you're composing music. We have our MIDI input and output ports, which are just like they sound like. So the MIDI input port is what you would connect to if you're using an external MIDI controller device, like another keyboard, or perhaps a intelligent mode 401 controller, something like that to control signals and parameters to the module. And then the output port is just that. You can set it up so that it basically acts as a pass-through to send that information off to another MIDI device. And then over here, to the far left, we have a little slider switch here that goes between 4 different positions and has basically an 8-pin mini-DIN connection. This is actually a serial input connection to connect it up to a PC. So if you had the right kind of cable, you could actually connect the module up to your computer and then select between the different PC types or even Macintosh to be able to interact with the module using additional software on a computer. But for the purposes of what I'm going to show and for what I actually use it for, which is very similar to the MT-200, basically playing back music and using it for playing back old DOS games in general MIDI mode and GS mode, I have to leave it in the MIDI selected switch here. So yeah, that's pretty much the bulk of the unit. So what I'll do now is I'll kind of give you a quick rundown of the diagnostics. Okay, I've now changed the angle of the camera and the lighting so that we can more easily see the control panel as well as the display while I'm working with the unit. Let me go ahead and power on the unit here. And you'll see that like the MT-200 similar to it, it comes up displaying that it's ready for a new song and just the default settings. Now one thing that is different is over here it actually says the word song and it's got like a little black dot over here. What you'll notice whenever I play back MIDI files later on this is that it's actually a bouncing ball that goes between each of those circles in addition to the beat light that's listed up here. So as the beat light's flashing, you have the little bouncing ball effect. Up here where it says new song, that's where it will display the song title. If you have a diskette loaded in place and you have a song ready to go, it'll display the title of the song that's been programmed in through the MIDI configuration, as well as, you know, what the current tempo of it is, what time measure it's using, and what measure of the song is currently being played. So the first thing I'll do is I'll go through the diagnostics on this unit. It's actually really easy to access the diagnostics. You just have to push down the song button while simultaneously then pressing count in and metronome. And when you do that, the unit will now switch over, but it will tell you what the unit is. In this case, it says it's an MT-300S. This isn't actually an S model. The S models are the ones that have included stereo speakers and is actually quite a bit larger than this, but it's the same firmware. Speaking of, it then lists what the firmware version is. In this case, we're running version 109. I don't know if that's the latest or not. It has a build number, and then it has the region country setting. There's only 2 settings, EXP and DOM. It stands for export or domestic. If this unit was actually being used in Japan, then it would actually be set for DOM for domestic, because again, Roland is a Japanese company. And then this has some sort of a CPU build date over here, the C11. Couldn't get much information on that. Now to navigate through the diagnostics, there's really only a couple of buttons we're going to have to use. That is the beat and tempo button, as well as the transpose button, which doubles as the enter key. And then depending on what the options are, we may have to use the encoder wheel over here to scroll through some other options. So as an example, if I go ahead and push transpose now, it's now going to do an internal device diagnostics test. So it's testing things internally that it expects to return a certain value. And then when it's done with a test, it takes you back to the version and build information screen, only now it will show OK if everything checked out. Let me go ahead and hit transpose again. And now it says button. And now it's got all this stuff on here. And in addition, if you look carefully, all of the LEDs are now lit up on the module. This is literally the LED and button test. So what it wants us to do is it wants us to start pushing buttons. And each of these lettered characters up here represents one of the buttons that it wants me to push. So as an example, we have the first one here, which is M. I believe that might be the button for marker clear? Yes. In addition to pressing the button, it will also make a piano tone. The next one, being B, is beat. So as you'll be able to hear, possibly it'll play a tone as I push each one of these. So beat, tempo, then it wants menu, disc, tune, reverb, and then this E over here, I believe is for edit, and then this RSBF is actually the reset, stop, back, forward, and then the 16 track button, like that. But you'll notice that while we don't have any other buttons, it still hasn't gone off this test. That's because we still need to push the additional buttons that we haven't yet. Marker AB buttons. Notice as I push those that the LEDs will turn off. Also, the song button has to be pushed twice. The song button, you'll notice that right now this LED is kind of an amber color on the beat. When I push the song button the first time, it changes to green and then finally goes off. And I'll have to do the same thing for the remaining buttons. Each of these will kind of have two colors that go with them, requiring me to have to press them more than one time. And that's it. Once the test is completed, it automatically advances to the next test. In this case, it's talking about pan. Now what this does is allow us to check not only the stereo effects, left and right, but also some of the other effects as well. So if I push the R button here for rhythm, it gives us a dry sound that doesn't really have any reverb. Push the 1 button and it sounds like this. It had some chorus on it. Push the track button, and we have some basic reverb. The next button will have additional reverb. And then we have the left, and then right, and then both channels together. And that's pretty much it as far as that test goes. Hit transpose. Now this is going to be basically additional testing that would require connecting it up to the computer, so I'm going to skip that one. This one is for the encoder. This is basically just that. It's more of a digital encoder. So it doesn't really matter in what position it's currently in. Additionally, it's only going to count up to 30 clicks plus or minus, even though the encoder will spin around in a complete 360 continuously. So the first thing it wants to do is to increase. So I'm just going to go ahead and spin it, and as I turn it around, it goes up. And once I hit 30, it'll say OK. And see, as I continue to go in the same direction clockwise to increase it, you'll see that it doesn't go above 30. Now, as soon as I start going in the other direction, it starts to decrease. And just like before, once I get back to 0, it will mark that one as being OK. And that's the encoder test. Then it wants the MIDI test. And again, this is similar to the computer test in that you would need additional cables and MIDI devices connected up just to check the communications. I'm going to skip that for now. And then it takes us to the diskette test. Now basically the way that this works is it's expecting you to plug in a floppy disk. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and plug in my USB flash drive into my Gotek here. It recognizes it as a double-sided high-density disk, and then the NG actually means that the disk is no good. It just doesn't happen to like the partitioning that gets used on these. But if I advance it up a little further, and it takes a few seconds here to read it. Now it came back and it said OK. Again, this is actually an empty partition that I formatted through the device itself. That's why it's OK with that one. But it actually reads the other partitions just fine. Now it takes us to the LCD test itself. The first part is just a blank test. The main purpose behind it being blank is to make sure you don't have any stray pixels or anything that's showing up that shouldn't be there. Yes, you will see that there are these two black lines, but those are actually imprinted on the LCD screen. They're not part of the LCD panel. In fact, those are always visible even when the unit's powered off. The first test will bring up most of the characters. As you can see here, we have quite a few characters being displayed. And then when you press the enter button or transpose button a second time, it does an alternate set of characters and display. And then from here, you have the ability to set the destination or the designation, depending on how you want to word this, of the module. Is it being used export, which means outside of Japan, or is it used domestically in Japan? So if you use the beat and tempo buttons, they actually correlate to these sections here. So if I hit beat, that means we're setting it to domestic. If I hit tempo, that sets it back to export. Because I'm in the United States, I will leave it as export. And then that's it. Once you hit the transpose or enter button again, that's the end of the diagnostics. So the only other thing to do from here is just to power cycle the unit. And that's really a real quick overview of the MT-300. There's really not a whole lot else. Most of the other functions, as far as how to copy music, how to format the diskettes, things like that, is almost identical to how it works on the MT-200. So again, if you see my video series on the MT-200, you'll have a large understanding of how to operate and use the MT-300. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hook up some direct music capture, and we'll just check out a few tunes. Some of these will be tunes that were in the MT-200, and then some of these are brand new that I've not really shown before, or I haven't really recorded before, just to give you an idea as to how the sound and capabilities of the MT-300 are as a module. So, let's check that out and be right back.